What if power were judged before you? I am Plato, a seeker of truth and eternal ideas. Across from me sits Machiavelli, who revealed power as it truly is. Two geniuses, opposing visions. If ideas challenge you, leave a like, subscribe, and comment which geniuses you want to see here.
If we want to understand where this world is heading, we must first ask ourselves what kind of soul we're forming in those who will inhabit it. I'm not talking about abstract morality or good intentions. I'm talking about something deeper. What do we truly value when we educate? What do we reward when we praise? What kind of excellence do we pursue when we organize our cities? Because the future isn't something that simply happens, Nicholas. It's something we cultivate, consciously or unconsciously, every time we decide what deserves admiration and what deserves to be forgotten. If we form souls that seek only immediate advantage, we'll build fragile societies, full of cunning but empty of substance. If we form souls that seek truth, even when it's uncomfortable, perhaps we'll have some chance of creating something that endures beyond the crises of the moment. The question isn't so much what technologies we'll have, but what people formed one way or another will do with them. Do you think the world can sustain itself without asking this first? Your question is beautiful, Plato, but it subtly shifts the real problem. Because the world doesn't sustain itself by asking what it should value, but by discovering what it actually values under pressure. I've seen republics fall not because their citizens lacked virtuous education, but because their institutions didn't withstand the arrival of armed ambition. I've seen principalities prosper not because they formed just souls, but because they knew how to maintain order with clear laws and credible punishments. The future we're building won't depend primarily on what we teach in classrooms, but on how we design incentives, power structures, mechanisms of mutual control among those who govern. If a system rewards virtue but tolerates corruption without consequences, you'll have corruption. If it rewards cunning but punishes betrayal firmly, you'll have precarious but functional stability. I don't deny your point about the formation of the soul, but I wonder, how many times in history has good education saved a badly governed city? You've touched on something important, but you're dodging the root. Because those institutions you say resist or fall don't arise from nothing and don't sustain themselves. Someone designed them. Someone defends them. Someone decides which laws matter and which are dead letters. And that someone is always a person formed in a certain way, with a certain understanding of what is just, convenient, or necessary. When you say a system must reward or punish in a particular way, who decides what deserves reward or punishment? Who has the moral authority to impose those rules if there's no prior agreement about what's good for the community? Your Republic of Florence fell not only due to institutional errors, but because those who governed it didn't share a common vision of what they were protecting. Institutions are empty shells without souls to inhabit them with judgment. Ask yourself this: what kind of institutions will someone design who only knows cunning and was never educated to seek justice? They'll design imperfect but durable institutions if they're prudent. Because prudence doesn't require education in Platonic justice, it requires understanding how human beings actually work. Florence fell, it's true, but not because there was no agreement on virtue, but because there was no capacity to maintain unity against external force. Rome lasted centuries without all its citizens sharing a common philosophical vision. What they shared was balanced mutual fear, respected laws, and a pragmatic sense of belonging. The institutions that will withstand the future won't be the most just by your definition, but the most adaptable, those that allow change without fracture, those that channel ambition without annihilating it. The problem with forming just souls is that when those souls face unjust souls with real power, they usually lose. I'd rather form citizens who understand how power works than citizens who despise it out of ignorance. Isn't that also a necessary form of education? It is a form of education, yes, but incomplete. Because if you only teach understanding power without teaching how to question it, you form people competent at manipulation, but incapable of knowing where to direct that competence. Knowledge of power without knowledge of the good is like handing a scalpel to someone who never learned anatomy. They can cut with precision, but they don't know what they're healing or what they're destroying. Rome lasted centuries, you say. But what kind of duration was it? How many civil wars? How many political assassinations? How much normalized violence because no one dared to ask if there was another way to organize power? The stability you describe isn't peace, Nicholas. It's administered fear. And administered fear can function for decades, even centuries, but it never generates true loyalty or deep cohesion. When the definitive crisis arrives, when the system needs someone to defend it without selfish calculation, that society discovers it has no moral reserves. It only has individuals calculating their own survival. And yet, those individuals calculating their survival can organize themselves better than just souls waiting for truth to triumph alone. Because the true loyalty and deep cohesion you value so much are rare, Plato, extraordinarily rare in actual history. Expecting an entire society to be formed by people capable of disinterested sacrifice is condemning it to fragility. It's better to design institutions that function even with mediocre, ambitious, and selfish people, because those will always be the majority. I'm not talking about cynicism, I'm talking about constructive realism. The administered fear, as you call it, may be preferable to the bloody chaos that appears when institutions collapse. You've seen what happens when a city loses order. Spontaneous justice doesn't flourish. The violence of the strongest appears. I prefer a system that contains the worst of human nature over one that naively trusts the best. Or has your ideal city ever existed outside your dialogues? It hasn't existed, but that doesn't invalidate its necessity as a reference. Because without a model of what a just city would be, how do you distinguish a good system from a merely functional one? How do you know if your constructive realism isn't simply disguised acceptance of what could be changed? You're right that most people won't reach the excellence I describe, but that doesn't mean we should give up trying to form them better. It means we must educate those who can reach it so they guide the rest. I'm not talking about imposing virtue by decree. I'm talking about creating conditions so that virtue is possible and recognizable. Your system designed for mediocre people guarantees perpetual mediocrity. Mine aims towards something better, knowing it won't always be achieved. What world does someone build who only expects the worst from others? What kind of self-fulfilling prophecy are you designing when your starting point is total distrust? A prophecy that lets me sleep soundly because I wasn't caught by surprise. But let's address your point honestly. It's not total distrust, it's distrust proportional to experience. I've seen what happens when rulers trust too much, when they believe good intentions are enough, when they assume others will share their sense of justice. They fall, and with them falls everything they wanted to protect. Your model of a just city can be a reference, but if it doesn't include mechanisms to deal with real injustice when it appears, it's not a model, it's a dangerous fantasy. The future won't be built by those who best imagine the good, but by those who best know how to defend what's been achieved against those who will try to destroy it. And those defenders need more than philosophical education. They need cunning, anticipation, the ability to act quickly under imperfect conditions. Ask me this, if you had to choose between a just but naive ruler and a cunning but morally ambiguous one, to whom would you entrust your city in times of war? I would reject the very premise of your question, because you assume that justice and strategic intelligence are incompatible, when in reality, true justice requires supreme intelligence, knowing when to act, how to act, what consequences each decision will have, not only today but in future generations. The ruler I describe isn't naive, Nicholas. They're someone who understands power so deeply that they don't need to use it constantly to sustain it. They know human nature better than you, precisely because they don't only study what people do when they're afraid, but also what they do when they trust, when they're inspired, when they see something greater than their own interest. Your cunning but morally ambiguous ruler may win immediate battles, but slowly destroys the trust that holds a society together. They create a world where everyone calculates possible betrayals before shared loyalties. That world may function temporarily, but it's doomed because no one really wants to inhabit it. They only tolerate it while they find no alternative. And while your perfectly just and strategic ruler finishes their decades of philosophical formation, who governs? Who makes the urgent decisions? Who negotiates with hostile neighbors or suppresses internal conspiracies? The problem with your model isn't that it's wrong, Plato. It's that it's impracticable in the real time where politics occurs. You need rulers now, not in 50 years. And among the rulers available today, I prefer the cunning one who understands immediate consequences over the virtuous one who doesn't understand how the enemies they face actually work. But let's acknowledge something. We both know that the future won't be built solely by philosophers or solely by strategists. It will be built by institutions that survive both. The question then changes. What institutions would you design for a world where the majority will be neither perfectly just nor completely cunning, but something in between and fluctuating? How do you build stability with imperfect and changing human materials? You build that stability not by accepting imperfection as the definitive horizon, but by creating structures that gradually elevate those who participate in them. The institutions that endure aren't those that simply contain chaos, but those that slowly transform the character of those who inhabit them. That's why I insist on education, not as indoctrination, but as progressive awakening of the capacity to discern the true from the apparent. The laws I propose don't just punish or reward behaviors, they also teach. Each civic ritual, each public ceremony, each judicial decision should be an opportunity for citizens to see reflected what the community considers valuable. If your institutions only repress the bad without showing the good, you generate mechanical obedience, not reflective adherence. And when external pressure increases, that obedience breaks because it was never genuine. The future we're building now, with technologies that amplify every voice and every impulse, needs more than ever educational institutions in this deep sense. Or are you going to govern with algorithms of fear? I'll govern with algorithms of aligned incentives, which is different, because fear is only one tool among several, and whoever depends solely on it is already in trouble. But neither can I depend on institutions magically transforming the character of millions of people. That takes time we don't always have. What I can do is design systems where each person's self-interest coincides with the collective interest, where betraying is more costly than cooperating, where ambition isn't eliminated, but channeled toward productive ends. Your civic ceremonies and educational rituals are valuable. I don't deny it, but they only work if behind them there are real consequences. If someone can violate norms without punishment because we trust in their character transformation, the system collapses. Durable institutions combine gradual education with immediate coercion. You can't have one without the other. The future will require both, perhaps in new proportions, but both. Are you willing to acknowledge that even your ideal city would need armed guardians and laws with teeth? I acknowledge it needs guardians, but I question who guards the guardians if no one was educated to understand why the laws exist. Because your real consequences only work if those who apply them aren't corruptible, and they're only incorruptible if they were formed in a certain way. Here's the circle you can't break with pure institutional strategy. For the system to work, you need trustworthy people in key positions, and to have trustworthy people, you need to have formed them that way. You can't design a perfect mechanism that works automatically with any operator. The human factor is irreducible. So if you accept that you need at least some exceptional citizens in critical roles, how do you form them without the kind of education I defend? And if you admit that education is necessary for some, why not extend it progressively to the rest? Because the risk of your model is that the guardians end up being just sophisticated mercenaries, effective while you pay them, disloyal as soon as a better offer appears. You form them through constant selection and testing, not through prolonged philosophical education. You seek people with demonstrated practical virtue. They've resisted real temptations. They've made difficult decisions with verifiable results. They've shown loyalty under concrete pressure. That education occurs in the exercise of power, not before. And then you can create structures where even if some fail, the system absorbs that failure without collapsing. Separation of powers, rotation of offices, mutual controls, forced transparency. No individual can be so critical that their corruption destroys everything. This isn't cynicism, Plato, it's prudent political engineering. On your question of extending philosophical education to the rest, I'd like to, honestly, but ask yourself how many are willing to make that effort. How many have the time, capacity, or genuine interest in questioning the appearances of the world when they have families to feed, businesses to sustain, concrete lives to live? Philosophy is for the few. Politics is for everyone. How do you reconcile that without turning philosophy into simplified propaganda? You don't turn it into propaganda. You make it practical without vulgarizing it. Because what you call philosophy for the few isn't the only type of education I propose. There are levels. Not everyone needs to reach direct contemplation of the forms, but everyone can learn to distinguish a solid argument from a fallacious one, an image from the reality it represents. Everyone can understand that some things are better than others, not by arbitrary convention, but by their very nature. That doesn't require decades of study. It requires well-designed civic culture. The problem is you start from the premise that people won't change significantly, so you design for that immobility. I start from the idea that they can change if the right conditions are created, so I design for that possibility. And here's the mutual risk. Your system perpetuates the mediocrity it assumes. Mine may fail if it overestimates the capacity for transformation, but at least my failure would have attempted something higher. What future do you prefer to bequeath? One where we function despite our mediocrity, or one where we try to overcome it? I prefer to bequeath a future that actually exists, not one that collapses from having bet too much on human elevation. But I acknowledge your point. If I only design for mediocrity, I guarantee it. So perhaps the question is how to combine both approaches without them canceling each other out. Robust institutions that function even with imperfect people, but that also reward and promote those who demonstrate excellence. Educational systems that don't demand philosophical perfection from everyone, but that identify early those who have capacity for more and prepare them for leadership. Laws that punish corruption immediately, but that also gradually cultivate better civic judgment. Is this possible? Or are we condemned to choose between your impracticable educational idealism and my soulless institutional realism? Because if neither pure model works, we need synthesis. And that synthesis requires that we both yield something. What would you be willing to yield? I would yield the expectation that everyone reaches the same level of understanding at the same time. I would accept that different people need different types of education according to their capacity and social role. Not everyone will be philosopher kings, and that's fine. Some will be excellent producers, others warriors, others administrators. The error would be to impose a single model. But I don't yield on this. Even in their different roles, everyone must understand that justice isn't arbitrary, that truth exists independently of opinion, that some forms of life are objectively better than others. Without that basic consensus, your system of incentives becomes empty manipulation. Citizens obey but don't comprehend, participate but don't commit. So I accept diversity of educational paths if you accept that all those paths must point towards something more than mere functioning. Can you design institutions that not only contain ambition, but also inspire shared purpose? I can design them, but I must warn you, that shared purpose will be more modest than your transcendent justice. It will be something like, we defend this republic because here we can live with relative dignity, not we seek the form of the good. Most people mobilize for concrete loyalties. Family, city, tradition, freedom from external tyranny. Those are genuine purposes, not arbitrary, but not philosophical in your sense either. And they work. Look at the cities that resisted invasions for centuries. It wasn't contemplation of forms that held them together. It was civic pride built on shared victories, remembered sacrifices, cultivated collective identity. That I can build. Institutions that celebrate that identity, that reinforce it in critical moments, that punish those who betray it. It's not your ideal philosophical education, but it's effective civic education. Is it enough for the future we'll face? Maybe not. But it's what we can do with real human materials in real time. Can your philosophical education compete with that in urgency and scale? It can if we stop seeing it as an alternative and see it as the necessary deepening of what you describe. Because that civic pride you mention, what is it based on if you don't examine its foundations? A city can take pride in unjust military victories, in wealth accumulated through exploitation, in traditions that perpetuate irrational inequality. If you only cultivate loyalty without cultivating judgment, you produce efficient fanatics, not wise citizens. The future we'll face will include technologies that enormously amplify both cooperation and manipulation. A society with strong civic identity, but without critical capacity, will be easy prey for demagogues who know how to exploit those shared symbols. You need citizens who love their city, but who can also ask themselves if what the city does is right. That critical capacity doesn't arise spontaneously. It must be cultivated. So yes, my philosophical education must compete with your urgency, because without it, your system eventually corrupts from within. What government better withstands the future? One where no one questions, or one where some question productively? Neither. One where everyone questions collapses into paralysis. One where no one questions collapses into tyranny. You need balance. Institutional mechanisms that allow questioning without each decision requiring universal philosophical consensus. Tribunes who represent the people, senates that deliberate, executives who act quickly when necessary. The future will probably require more sophisticated versions of these checks and balances. Systems where technology itself helps make decisions transparent without paralyzing action. But here's my fear with your model. If educating critical judgment takes generations, who governs in the meantime? And if the crisis arrives before your philosophical education has formed enough wise citizens? I prefer imperfect institutions today over unattainable perfection tomorrow. That said, I acknowledge that without some dose of what you defend, my institutions become soulless shells. So perhaps the synthesis is strategic institutions that function immediately, philosophical education that improves them gradually. Can we build that hybrid future together? We can try, but only if you recognize that hybrid doesn't mean simply juxtaposing strategy and ideals as separate compartments. It means designing institutions whose internal logic pushes toward excellence, even though those who operate them aren't excellent yet. Laws that don't just prohibit corruption, but make visible why corruption destroys communities. Educational systems where even the teaching of trades includes reflection on the good that trade contributes to the city. Elections where not simply whoever promises more wins, but whoever demonstrates better understanding of complex problems. The challenge is that your strategic institutions, if they don't incorporate this intrinsic educational dimension, tend to degrade into pure administration of conflicting interests. They become neutral between good and bad ends, limiting themselves to arbitrating the clash without asking which clash is worth resolving. And that moral neutrality is suicidal in the long term, because when the civilizational crisis arrives, you discover that no one knows why to defend the system. They only know how to use it. How do you avoid that internal decay of your own institutions? You avoid it by making institutions not depend on internal virtue to function. You design them so that the vice of some controls the vice of others. Ambition against ambition, power against power. If a corrupt magistrate knows another magistrate is watching him because he also wants his position, both moderate themselves mutually. Not through virtue, but through opposing interest. That's more reliable than hoping both will be just through education. On your point about moral neutrality, institutions shouldn't be neutral about everything, but they should tolerate plurality of conceptions of the good within limits. Because if you impose a single philosophical vision of the good, you're one step from well-intentioned tyranny. It's better that institutions protect the freedom to choose between different visions while harshly punishing what destroys coexistence itself. Betrayal, arbitrary violence, theft. That's not moral neutrality. It's prudent pluralism. Or does your ideal city impose a single conception of the good even on those who reasonably dissent? It doesn't impose, but neither does it pretend all conceptions of the good are equivalent. Because if you accept that some forms of life are objectively better than others, and I think deep down you accept this when you say betrayal and violence are real evils, then institutions can't be completely neutral. They must favor the best forms of life without annihilating the freedom of those who don't yet understand them. It's a delicate balance, I acknowledge, but your model of ambition against ambition has a limit. It can prevent a single corrupt person from dominating, but it doesn't prevent everyone from being corrupt at the same time. If the entire political class shares the same interest in maintaining privileges against the people, your system of mutual controls collapses because no one really watches. You need at least some citizens formed to defend the common good, even when it goes against their immediate interest. And those don't emerge from mutual rivalry, they emerge from the education you disdain. How do you resolve this without resorting to what I propose? I resolve it through constant rotation of elites. You don't allow a political class to consolidate generationally. You limit terms, alternate territories, mix old families with new talents. You maintain sufficient social mobility so there are always ambitious outsiders willing to denounce the corruptions of those installed. And yes, I acknowledge this requires at least some citizens with a sense of common good. But I insist, you don't need them to be a philosophically educated majority. You need a critical minority with access to institutional mechanisms to act. Tribunes, ombudsmen, free press, public accountability. The future will probably add transparency technologies that make it harder to hide systemic corruption, public blockchains of governmental decisions, automated audits, social networks that amplify denunciations that can partially compensate for the lack of universal philosophical education. But give me your strongest point. What happens in my model that only your education would solve? Grant me the scenario where you're definitively right. This happens. A crisis arrives where all possible solutions require immediate sacrifice for future benefit that no one will see in their lifetime. Catastrophic climate change, resource collapse, prolonged civilizational war. Your system of opposing incentives works well for problems where there's visible gain for someone today. But when the common good requires everyone to lose something valuable without guarantee of recovering it, the incentives collapse. No one wants to be first to sacrifice while others take advantage. Your ambition against ambition becomes a race to the abyss where everyone takes what they can before the collapse. At that moment, you need citizens capable of acting from duty, not from interest, capable of defending principles even if it costs them everything. Those citizens don't arise from strategic institutions. They arise from deep education that prepared them to understand that some things are worth more than life itself. Your model has no answer for that scenario. Mine at least tries to prepare it. What would you do when that terminal crisis arrives where individual and collective interest absolutely diverge? First, avoid it arriving through strategic prevention, early warning systems, action before the crisis becomes terminal. But let's grant it fails. Your apocalyptic scenario arrives. Then I appeal to the only thing that can mobilize masses without prior philosophical education: collective survival threatened by common enemy. Humans cooperate extraordinarily when they perceive imminent extinction of the group, not through educated virtue, through ancient tribal instinct. Quickly reconfigure institutions to channel that fear into coordinated action. Leaders who personify the required sacrifice, who go first, who make the cost and necessity visible. It's not your philosophical education, but it works. Clear emergency laws, administered firmly, exemplary punishment for those who exploit the crisis. And yes, perhaps I need some of your educated citizens in key roles to design and execute this without it becoming tyranny. But what won't work is waiting for philosophical education to have prepared majorities for serene self-sacrifice. That's dangerous fantasy. Or do you have historical evidence that your model saved any civilization in terminal crisis without resorting to what I describe? I have evidence that civilizations, without the kind of education I defend, didn't survive terminal crises with their humanity intact. They survived, if at all, by becoming something worse. Brutal empires where human life is worth nothing, perpetual dictatorships justified by emergency, systems where fear became permanent because no one remembered another way to organize. Your appeal to tribal instinct works, yes, but at what price? Because that tribal instinct also generates xenophobia, scapegoats, internal violence against dissidents. Without education that tempers those impulses with reason, your emergency mobilization becomes functional fascism. You solve the immediate crisis by creating something horrible that will endure for generations. I prefer to risk collapse trying to elevate humanity than to guarantee survival at the cost of becoming inhuman. And here's my limit with you. I don't accept that every response to crisis must be instinctive. Sometimes reason must guide even against instinct. Or are you going to tell me you never imagined a society better than what tribal fear builds? I imagine better societies constantly, but I build them with available tools, not with ones I wish I had. And here's my limit with you. Your duty to educate before acting can condemn real people to real death while you wait to form perfect souls. Each day that passes without functional institutions, however imperfect, is one more day of concrete suffering. Real hunger, real violence, real oppression. Your educational idealism is a privilege of tranquil times. In crisis, you need immediate action with current resources. But let's acknowledge something uncomfortable for both. Perhaps neither of our pure models works alone. Perhaps the future will require constant oscillation between moments where your education builds civilizational height and moments where my strategy preserves basic survival. Periods of slow cultivation and periods of rapid reaction. Can you accept that your vision isn't always sufficient? That sometimes urgency defeats perfection? I accept that urgency exists. I don't accept that urgency justifies giving up asking what we're preserving and why. Because if in each crisis we abandon principles for pragmatism, eventually nothing remains worth preserving. Only hollow survival. Your oscillation sounds reasonable but hides a problem. Emergency habits don't disappear when the crisis passes. Exception institutions become normalized. Fear perpetuates itself, and then your period of rapid reaction becomes permanent state. I've seen republics that never recovered liberties temporarily suspended. I've seen emergency leaders who never returned temporarily concentrated power. Your model assumes we can return to educational normalcy afterward. I doubt history permits those clean returns. Each crisis changes us. The question is whether it changes us towards something better or something worse. And that depends on whether we have prior educational anchoring that allows us to resist the temptation to normalize the exceptional. Without that anchoring, your emergency pragmatism becomes a slippery slope toward institutionalized barbarism. And without my emergency pragmatism, your educational anchoring never has a chance to develop because the city collapses first. Look, Plato, we've reached the real core of the disagreement. You fear my model produces gradual tyranny. I fear your model produces paralyzing collapse. Both fears are valid, both grounded in real history. So the honest question is, does a synthesis exist that avoids both abysses? Or are we condemned to choose between your risks and mine depending on the moment? Because if it's the latter, the future will be permanent oscillation without cumulative progress. Slow educational construction, crisis that destroys it, pragmatic reconstruction, new educational construction, endless cycle. Do you see a way out of that cycle? Some institutional design that preserves your education even in crisis and my pragmatism even in calm. Because if there isn't, we've both failed to think the future adequately. I see a way out, but it requires recognizing something that makes both of us uncomfortable. The institutions we seek must incorporate their own capacity for critical self-reflection. Not just execute functions, but periodically ask themselves if those functions still serve the right end. This means institutionalizing philosophy itself, not as separate academy, but as permanent function of government. Councils of sages without executive power but with moral authority to question existing laws. Ritual moments where the city stops its usual activity and collectively deliberates on its course. Mandatory education that includes not just trades, but also capacity for argumentation and self-reflection. Your fear is this will paralyze action. My answer is that action without reflection accumulates errors until collapse. Some ancient societies had primitive versions of this: citizen assemblies, ritualized public debates, periodic examinations of magistrates. They collapsed not because they reflected too much, but because they didn't do it with sufficient depth or consistency. The future could implement this technologically: systems that force transparency, that record decisions, that permit continuous citizen audit. But it only works if citizens were educated to use those tools critically. Your council of sages without executive power but with moral authority faces an immediate problem. Who elects them? Who guarantees they're truly wise and not simply skilled manipulators of philosophical appearance? I've seen too many sages who turned out to be in service of political factions. Your institutionalization of philosophy can quickly become institutionalization of certain ideology disguised as wisdom. That said, your point about institutionalized critical self-reflection is valuable. Perhaps not through councils of sages, but through mechanisms that force periodic review of all legislation. Laws with automatic expiration clauses. Institutions that must re-justify their existence each generation. Rotation not just of people, but also of structures. This introduces your reflection without creating a new philosophical priestly class. And yes, it requires basic civic education to function. Citizens capable of reading proposals, evaluating arguments, voting informedly. Not your complete philosophical education, but more than simple obedience. Is that intermediate level sufficient? Or will you insist that without contemplation of the forms everything is insufficient? That intermediate level is a necessary beginning, but not a sufficient end, because the capacity to evaluate arguments requires evaluation criteria. And those criteria don't arise from nothing. They must be taught, justified, defended. What you call basic civic education inevitably touches philosophical questions. What makes an argument good? Why prefer truth over immediate utility? What distinguishes genuine knowledge from plausible opinion? Answering these questions without philosophy is impossible. So your intermediate level, if taken seriously, naturally leads to what I propose. On who elects the sages, the same problem exists with any authority. Who elects your strategic magistrates? The answer is you need a public, transparent selection process based on verifiable demonstration of capacity. Not perfect, but better than alternatives. And yes, there will be errors, manipulations, failures. But the alternative of not institutionalizing critical reflection is worse. It guarantees institutions ossify into forms that stopped serving the common good decades ago. Your automatic rotation helps but isn't enough. What do you do when a bad law rotates and is replaced by another bad law because no one questions the underlying assumptions? You need someone asking, why do we do it this way? That someone can be organized political opposition, free press, independent civic organizations. You don't need a special philosophical council. In fact, multiplying dispersed critical voices is safer than concentrating them in a single institution with moral authority. Because your council of sages, even well-intentioned, can become suffocating orthodoxy. The sages have spoken, no more questioning. I prefer chaotic plural dissent over imposed philosophical unanimity. On your fundamental questions, what makes an argument good? Why prefer truth? I accept they require answers, but those answers can be pragmatic without being philosophical. An argument is good if it withstands counter-arguments and produces verifiable results. We prefer truth because societies based on lies eventually collapse. I don't need contemplation of Platonic forms to get there. I need careful historical observation. So yes, let's educate citizens in critical reasoning. But don't assume that inevitably leads to your philosophy. It can lead to plurality of philosophies competing openly. Can you tolerate that? Or does your ideal city require eventual convergence on your truth? It requires convergence on method of seeking truth, not necessarily on definitive contents. Because if plurality means any opinion is worth as much as any other, then no dialogue is possible, only noise. There must be shared criteria of rationality, evidence, coherence. Within those criteria, I accept genuine disagreement. But you just did something revealing. You reduced truth to verifiable utility. Societies based on lies collapse. That's a pragmatic argument, not justification for why truth matters intrinsically. And there's the limit of your model. If we only value truth for its practical consequences, then in situations where lies work better temporarily, there's no reason to prefer truth. Your own framework justifies strategic manipulation when it's effective. My framework says truth matters even when it's inconvenient, because reality doesn't disappear from ignoring it. That philosophical difference produces radically different institutions. Yours optimize for immediate results. Mine optimize for alignment with deep reality, which build a more sustainable future. Mine build a future that actually comes to exist. Yours build an ideal that may never materialize. But I acknowledge your point. If I only value truth instrumentally, I justify manipulation when convenient. So I need a complement. Also valuing truth because societies that abandon it lose capacity for self-correction. They lock themselves in false narratives until reality brutally strikes them. This is more than immediate utility, it's long-term prudence. I'd almost say it's a form of your virtue, but expressed in strategic language. On shared criteria of rationality, completely agreed. Without them, there's no politics, only war. But those criteria are more modest than your complete philosophy. Basic logic, empirical evidence, argumentative coherence. Anyone with decent secondary education can learn that. Your error is thinking that to have those criteria, you need your entire metaphysical structure of Platonic forms and tripartite souls. You don't need it. You can have reasonable citizens without philosopher kings. Why do you insist on the latter when the former would already be an enormous victory? Because the former is unstable without the latter. Your modest criteria, basic logic, empirical evidence, work well for technical problems. But politics constantly faces questions where those criteria aren't enough. What is justice? When is war justified? How to balance individual freedom and common good? What obligations do we have to future generations? These questions aren't resolved with formal logic or controlled experiments. They require deep philosophical reflection on human nature, common good, moral obligation. Without that reflection, your modest criteria produce efficient technocracy, but blind to ultimate ends. You govern well for wrong objectives. And here's the challenge the future will face. Increasingly powerful technologies, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, climate control, require increasingly more wisdom to use well. Your modest education doesn't prepare for those decisions. Mine at least tries. Would you trust those technologies to people who only have basic logic, but never reflected deeply on what constitutes good human life? I wouldn't trust them to anyone blindly, including your philosophers, because power corrupts even those who studied the good for decades. Even more if they believe their education makes them immune to corruption. Your questions, what is justice, when war, have varied philosophical answers after millennia of debate. There's no consensus. So in practice, those who govern must decide without definitive philosophical certainty. Better that those decisions pass through multiple institutional filters than through the judgment of a single sage, however enlightened. On dangerous future technologies, totally agree they require wisdom. But that wisdom can be collective, distributed, emergent from multiple confronting perspectives. It doesn't need to concentrate in a philosophical elite. In fact, concentrating it is more dangerous. A mistaken council of sages can cause irreversible catastrophe. A system of distributed controls at least permits correction of partial errors. I prefer robust wisdom over superior but fragile wisdom. Do you see the difference? Or for you is wisdom always individual, never collective? I see the difference, and I acknowledge value in distributed collective wisdom. But it only works if those who participate have a certain minimum level of preparation. Your system of distributed controls with inadequately educated people becomes populism, where the loudest opinion defeats the most rigorous truth. You need citizens capable of participating in that collective wisdom without degrading it into demagoguery. And that requires, again, the education you consider too ambitious. So we're in a circle. I say your system needs my education to function. You say my education is impracticable without your system already functioning. Perhaps that circle is theoretically unsolvable, but practicable in real time. We start with your imperfect but functional institutions. Within them, we gradually cultivate my deeper education. That education improves the institutions, which in turn permit better education. Virtuous cycle instead of vicious circle. But it requires you accept that your institutions aren't the ultimate end, only temporary means. Can you make that concession? Recognize that what you build is necessary scaffolding, but not definitive structure. I can concede that if you concede that your philosophical education also isn't the ultimate end, that it must evolve, adapt, question itself, that today's philosophers don't have the final word on truth that future philosophers will discover. If we both accept the provisional nature of our models, then yes, we can build that virtuous cycle. My strategic institutions protect space for your philosophical education. Your philosophical education improves the quality of those who operate my institutions. Both criticize each other, correct themselves, evolve. Neither dominates completely. And here's what's uncomfortable. That balance requires permanent tension. We'll never arrive at definitive synthesis where one of us was completely right. The future will be constant negotiation between your educational idealism and my institutional pragmatism, between aspirational height and concrete functioning, between asking what we should do and doing what's possible today. Can you live with that perpetual ambiguity? Or do you need certainty that your model will eventually triumph? I can live with permanent tension if it's productive, not if it's mere oscillation without progress. Because there must be accumulation. Each generation must inherit better institutions and better formed citizens than the previous one. If we only oscillate between your pragmatic crises and my educational periods without retention of what's learned, we're condemned to repeat errors. The future we build must have deep institutional memory. Systems that remember not just what worked, but why it worked. Citizens who understand history not as a list of events, but as humanity's moral laboratory. That educated memory is what permits cumulative progress. Without it, your pragmatism becomes blind reaction that reinvents the wheel in each crisis. With it, each generation starts one step further ahead. So yes, I accept permanent tension, but oriented towards something. Not just surviving, but improving. Not just functioning, but flourishing. That's the future worth building, one where each generation has more material and intellectual tools to live well than the previous one. Do you share that direction, even if we disagree on the path? I share the direction with realistic caution, because progress isn't guaranteed or linear. Civilizations collapse, knowledge is lost, institutions degenerate. Each generation must actively defend what's inherited against forces that would destroy it. Your educated institutional memory is valuable but fragile. A single enlightened tyrant can burn libraries. A single negligent generation can forget lessons learned in blood. That's why I insist on robust institutions that resist even when citizens aren't up to the task. On flourishing versus surviving, flourishing requires survival first. You can't contemplate Platonic forms on an empty stomach or while being invaded. Sequence matters. But yes, once basic survival is guaranteed, we should aim higher. The problem is survival is never completely guaranteed. There's always the next crisis, the next threat, the next potential collapse. We live in permanent precariousness. In that context, what portion of our resources do we dedicate to your elevated education versus my defensive preparation? 50-50, 80-20. Does it change according to circumstances? Who decides the proportion? Whoever understands that both are necessary and that the proportion varies according to the moment, but must never reach zero in either. Even in maximum crisis, you need some educating the next generation. Even in maximum peace, you need some preparing defense of what's been achieved. The error is thinking we must choose definitively. Political wisdom consists precisely in calibrating that proportion dynamically. And that requires exceptional leaders who understand both dimensions, who don't despise your pragmatism or my idealism. Leaders who are philosophically educated to think long-term but also strategically to act short-term. Those leaders are rare, I acknowledge. That's why I insist on educational institutions that form them systematically. We can't depend on them appearing spontaneously. Now, after all this dialogue, I ask directly, if you had to design the central educational institution for the city of the future, what would it teach? Pure strategy? Pure philosophy? Some combination? And who guarantees that institution doesn't corrupt into an instrument of indoctrination? It would teach 3 integrated levels. First, practical trades and basic literacy for everyone. Without this, nothing else matters. Second, for those who show capacity, critical reasoning applied to real problems. Analysis of historical dilemmas, structured debate, decision-making under uncertainty. Third, for the most capable minority, deep philosophy, including your metaphysics, rigorous ethics, political thought from Plato to contemporaries. But each level must include confrontation with real failure. Not just theory, also practice with consequences. Students temporarily governing small communities, facing decisions where there's no obviously correct answer, seeing how their errors affect real people. On who guarantees it doesn't corrupt. No one guarantees it completely, but we can make it difficult. Plurality of competing educational institutions, not state monopoly. Constant external audit. Teacher rotation. Prohibition of educational institution having direct political power. and citizenry educated in levels 1 and 2 capable of questioning what level 3 produces. It's imperfect, like everything, but better than alternatives. Your turn. How do you prevent your philosopher rulers from becoming philosophical tyranny? I subject them to education that destroys them as potential tyrants before giving them power. Years of training where they must question their own certainties, face limits of their knowledge, learn that governing is serving, not dominating. And then when finally they're called to govern, they do it reluctantly, as civic obligation, not as fulfilled ambition. Whoever truly desires power shouldn't have it. Whoever accepts it only from duty perhaps is prepared to exercise it well. This sounds utopian, I know, but at least it points in the right direction, forming leaders who control themselves before controlling others. Your system of external controls is necessary, I don't deny it, but insufficient if those who govern lack internal self-control. So we need both, your robust institutional structure plus my deep character formation. And here we reach the real limit of our dialogue, because after all this, we both know neither will completely convince the other. The question isn't who's right, but what does someone who listened to us to the end do? What will you trust, you who've heard us debate to the finish? In institutions that function even when people fail, or in people educated to rise to institutions? Or will you accept, like us, that you need both in perpetual tension, and then ask, how do I contribute to building that fragile balance?